At 11:47 p.m. on February 6, 1996, somewhere over the dark Atlantic waters north of the Dominican Republic, a Boeing 757 ceased to exist as a flyable machine. It had been airborne for less than 5 minutes. The last words captured on the cockpit voice recorder were not the calm, methodical exchanges of trained aviators executing emergency procedures. They were the fractured, desperate utterances of men who had been betrayed by their aircraft, by their instruments, and ultimately by a series of decisions made over the preceding 3 weeks that nobody had thought to question. "Don't pull back. Please don't pull back." Then silence. Birgenair Flight 301 struck the Atlantic Ocean at high speed, killing all 189 people on board. The wreckage sank to the floor of the Caribbean Sea, taking with it the physical evidence of what had gone wrong. It would take a United States Navy remote-controlled submarine, a multinational investigation team, and months of painstaking analysis before investigators could piece together the chain of events. When they did, what they found was simultaneously mundane and terrifying. A wasp had built a nest in a tube roughly the diameter of a human thumb. That nest, and the decisions made in response to the chaos it created in the cockpit, killed 189 people. But to say that a wasp killed 189 people would be to miss the point entirely. The wasp was merely the final, absurd link in a chain that stretched back through maintenance decisions, training deficiencies, regulatory gaps, and the most dangerous of all human tendencies, the confident assumption that everything is probably fine. This is the story of Birgenair Flight 301. It is in many ways the story of aviation itself. Part 1. A plane on the ground. Puerto Plata sits on the northern coast of the Dominican Republic, a city of sun-bleached colonial architecture and white sand beaches that had, by the mid-1990s, established itself as a modest hub for European charter tourism. On January 12, 1996, a Boeing 757 bearing the Turkish registration Tango Charlie Golf Echo November rolled to a stop at Gregorio Luperón International Airport and shut down its engines. The aircraft belonged to Birgenair, an Istanbul-based Turkish charter carrier that had been operating since 1988. It had come to Puerto Plata as part of the airline's winter charter season and was expected to remain there for a short time while the schedule was arranged. It would sit there for 25 days. While Tango Charlie Golf Echo November slept on the tarmac at Puerto Plata, its Pitot tubes, the small metal probes that project from the aircraft's fuselage and measure airspeed by the pressure of oncoming air, were left uncovered. Boeing's maintenance manual contained, as investigators would later discover, ambiguities about exactly when Pitot tube covers were required and for how long they could be left off. These ambiguities were not resolved. Nobody covered the tubes, and into those small cylindrical openings, a wasp found exactly the kind of shelter it was looking for. Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you about an insect. The black and yellow mud dauber is a solitary wasp found throughout the Americas. It does not live in colonies and does not sting unless directly handled. It is, in most respects, a completely unremarkable insect. What makes the mud dauber relevant to aviation is its nesting behavior. Unlike social wasps, which build communal paper nests, the mud dauber creates small cylindrical chambers made of mud, each one approximately the diameter of its own body, in which it deposits paralyzed spiders and a single egg before sealing the chamber and moving on. The mud dauber finds these chambers wherever it can, in wall crevices, under eaves, in drainage pipes, and, as Dominican pilots had long known, in the open ends of Pitot tubes. The mud dauber's nest is dense, compact, and, this is the critical point, almost completely impermeable to air. At some point during the aircraft's 25 days on the ground at Puerto Plata, a mud dauber found the uncovered opening of the captain's Pitot tube and built a nest inside it. The nest was so well constructed and so thoroughly dried in the Caribbean heat that it would survive the aircraft's engine test run 2 days before. The first officer's Pitot tube was clean. The relief pilot's Pitot tube was clean. Only the captain's tube was blocked. This distinction, the fact that only one of 3 Pitot systems was affected, would prove to be both the investigators' greatest clue and the crew's greatest trap. Part 2. The night of February 6th. The flight that would become Birgenair 301 was not originally supposed to be operated by this aircraft. The plane originally scheduled for the route, a flight from Puerto Plata to Frankfurt, Germany, via Gander, Canada, and Berlin, had experienced a technical problem and been grounded. With 176 passengers waiting in the terminal, Birgenair needed a solution. Tango Charlie Golf Echo November was the solution. The decision to put a 25-day dormant aircraft into service on a transatlantic flight was not, in itself, catastrophically unreasonable. Airlines do this. Aircraft sit. They are brought back into service. There are procedures for this. What mattered was whether those procedures had been followed. An engine test run had been conducted 2 days earlier. It had gone well. The aircraft had been signed off as airworthy. The Pitot tube covers had been removed for the engine test, and here the maintenance records become frustratingly vague, apparently had not been replaced afterward. Nobody knows exactly when the mud dauber built its nest. The window was at most 48 hours. The man in the left seat was Ahmet Erdem, 61 years old, with 24,750 flight hours accumulated over a career that stretched back to the early years of Turkish aviation. He was one of Birgenair's most senior and experienced pilots. He had flown 757s. He knew the aircraft. In the right seat was First Officer Aykut Gergen, 34, with 3,500 total hours. Competent, but a relative newcomer to the 757, having accumulated only 71 hours on type. Behind them, in the relief pilot seat, was Mulis Evrenisolu, 51, with 15,000 hours total and 121 on the 757. The crew briefed the cabin staff, reviewed the weather, overcast, with a cloud base at 7,000 feet, and prepared for departure. The flight plan called for a north-northeastern departure, climbing out over the Atlantic before turning toward Canada. It was a routine transatlantic charter. Hundreds of them departed Caribbean airports every week. At 11:42 p.m., Birgenair 301 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing to runway 08. At 11:42 p.m. and 32 seconds, the crew advanced the throttles and began the takeoff roll. Within moments, something was wrong. The captain's airspeed indicator, fed directly by the blocked Pitot tube, initially showed nothing. Then, as speed increased and the partial blockage was overcome by the growing pressure differential, it began to move. But it was reading high, dramatically, lethally high. The first officer's indicator, fed by his clean Pitot tube, was reading correctly. At the speed the aircraft was actually traveling, Gergen's instrument showed 213 knots. Erdem's instrument, corrupted by the wasp nest, showed something very different, an airspeed that was accelerating far beyond the normal parameters for this phase of flight. "Both of them are wrong," Erdem said, referring to the 2 airspeed indicators. This was the first critical error. The captain had correctly identified a discrepancy. The 2 instruments disagreed, but had drawn the wrong conclusion. Rather than recognizing that one instrument was faulty and the other was correct, he concluded that both were malfunctioning. This was not an irrational conclusion. Erdem had 24,750 hours of experience, but virtually none of that experience included a scenario where one of two pitot tubes was partially blocked while the other remained clean. The training of the era did not adequately prepare pilots for exactly this type of failure mode. And without that training, the natural human instinct to treat the anomaly as symmetrical, to assume that if something is wrong, it's probably wrong across the board, took over. The aircraft reached rotation speed. Erdem pulled back. The 757 climbed into the dark Caribbean sky. The trap was sprung. Part 3. The Cascade. Modern commercial aircraft are in many ways brilliantly engineered systems. The Boeing 757 of the mid-90s was equipped with autopilot and autothrottle systems that could manage the aircraft's speed and flight path with precision that no human pilot could match over the long hours of a transatlantic crossing. These systems were designed to make flying safer and reduce crew workload. They were not designed for a scenario where the data they received was systematically false. Approximately 1 minute after takeoff, the crew engaged the autopilot. In the default configuration of the Boeing 757 at the time, the autopilot took its airspeed reference from the captain's pitot system. The captain's pitot system was showing an airspeed that was far too high. The autopilot's logic was impeccable given the data it was working with. If the aircraft is going too fast, reduce thrust and raise the nose to slow down. This is exactly what it did. The autothrottle began pulling back the engines. The autopilot began raising the nose. The actual airspeed, the real speed of the aircraft through the air, began to fall. Aboard Birgenair 301, a horrifying inversion was taking place. The aircraft's automation, designed to protect the crew, was actively flying the plane into a stall because it believed, based on false data, that it was doing the opposite. The Boeing 757 is, as one former captain described it, a remarkably good communicator. It has sensors for almost everything, and when those sensors detect something wrong, they tell the crew. The problem is that they all tell the crew at once, and they tell the crew in overlapping, sometimes contradictory voices. As the aircraft climbed through the darkness, the warnings began. The overspeed warning horn, triggered because the captain's corrupted airspeed indicator was showing a speed far above the maximum operating speed, began blaring in the cockpit. This was the automation responding to the false data. You are going too fast. Simultaneously, as the actual airspeed continued to fall toward stall speed, the stick shaker activated. This is an electromechanical device that physically vibrates the control column to warn pilots of an impending stall. This was the aircraft responding to reality. You are going too slow. Overspeed warning, stick shaker, overspeed warning, stick shaker. 2 warnings, 2 opposite emergencies. One of them was real. The crew was also faced with the rudder ratio caution light, a warning that the rudder authority system had switched modes. Relevant in high-speed flight, completely irrelevant in their actual situation, but another data point demanding attention, adding to the noise. Post-accident research by the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, would reveal something that aviation trainers found deeply troubling. When experienced test pilots were placed in simulators and subjected to the same combination of conflicting warnings, overspeed horn plus stick shaker, a significant proportion of them could not correctly diagnose the situation. The scenario was cognitively overwhelming. The brain, faced with 2 simultaneous and contradictory emergencies, struggled to find a framework that explained both. For Erdem, Gergen, and Evangelos, there was no framework. This exact scenario had never been part of their 757 type training. There was no memory item for a blocked pitot tube, causing simultaneous overspeed and stall warning. There was no procedure posted in the quick reference handbook under what to do when the aircraft is telling you it's going too fast while also going too slow. The overspeed warning horn, in the hierarchy of things that kill pilots, is terrifying. The mental image of a Boeing 757 exceeding its structural limits, the wings bending and folding, is visceral and immediate. The stick shaker, by contrast, is a warning that pilots are trained to associate with low-speed, low-altitude scenarios. A botched approach, a turn too tight on final. At altitude, in the dark, with the autopilot engaged and the autothrottle pulling back, the captain's instincts told him he was going too fast. Everything he could see on his instruments confirmed this. And in response to what his instruments were showing, his training told him to do exactly what the autopilot was already doing. Reduce thrust, raise the nose, slow down. He pulled back on the throttle. The engines, already being retarded by the autothrottle, spooled down further. The real airspeed, already critically low, fell further still. The stick shaker was screaming at him. But the stick shaker was telling him he was about to stall, and his instruments were telling him he couldn't possibly be stalling because he was going far too fast. The human brain, under extreme stress, tends to prioritize the information that fits its mental model of the situation. Erdem's mental model told him he was over-speeding. The stick shaker didn't fit that model. It was anomalous. It was, his stressed and overwhelmed mind decided, another malfunctioning instrument. Both of them are wrong. Birgenair 301 stalled. At 11:47 p.m., 5 minutes and 11 seconds after beginning the takeoff roll, the Boeing 757 entered an aerodynamic stall from which recovery was not possible. The nose dropped. The aircraft began to fall. The cockpit voice recorder captured the final seconds. "Don't pull back. Please don't pull back. Oh, what's happening?" Flight 301 struck the Atlantic Ocean at high speed. The impact was non-survivable. All 189 people on board, 176 passengers, mostly German tourists returning home from Caribbean holidays, and 13 crew members, were killed. The aircraft sank to the floor of the sea, taking most of the wreckage with it. Part 4. Finding the evidence. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, the black boxes, though they are actually bright orange, are designed to survive impacts that would destroy the rest of the aircraft. They are also equipped with underwater locator beacons that emit an acoustic ping once per second, designed to be detectable for at least 30 days after immersion. The beacons work. What they don't do is make the recovery effort simple. The water off Puerto Plata is deep. In some areas, deeper than 2,000 meters. Standard Navy diving equipment cannot reach those depths. What was needed was the Curve the Third, the cable-controlled underwater recovery vehicle operated by the United States Navy, a remotely operated submersible capable of working at depths far beyond the reach of human divers. The Curve found the recorders. They were recovered, along with portions of the wreckage, and sent to the Dominican Republic's Accident Investigation Authority. The data they contained would tell investigators almost everything, but not quite everything that they needed to know. The flight data recorder told investigators the aircraft's actual airspeed at every moment of the flight. Overlaid with the captain's indicator readings, it revealed the catastrophic divergence that had developed from the moment of takeoff. The captain's instrument showing speeds dramatically higher than actual, the first officer's instrument tracking reality correctly, the aircraft's actual speed falling steadily throughout the brief flight. The cockpit voice recorder told investigators what the crew had been saying, and perhaps more importantly, what they had not been saying. There was no moment where one pilot said to another, "Ignore the overspeed warning, it must be the blocked Pitot." There was no moment where the crew executed the cross-check procedure that would have revealed that only one of the three Pitot systems was malfunctioning. There was no moment where any of the three aviators in that cockpit identified the root cause of what was happening. There was, instead, the sound of three experienced professional pilots being systematically overwhelmed by a scenario they had never been trained to handle. Investigators examined the aircraft's maintenance records and quickly identified the 25-day dormancy period. They noted the absence of documentation confirming that Pitot tube covers had been in place throughout. They collected testimony from Dominican airport staff and Birgenair mechanics. They examined the Boeing maintenance manuals and found the troubling ambiguities about Pitot cover requirements. But they never found the physical evidence they needed most. The Pitot tubes themselves were not recovered from the ocean floor. The investigation could not prove, with the certainty that physical evidence demands, that a mud dauber nest had caused the blockage. What the investigation could establish was a highly probable chain of events. The aircraft had been parked, uncovered, in a region where mud dauber wasps were known to enter Pitot tubes. Dominican pilots had dealt with this problem before. The flight data recorder data was consistent only with a blockage in the captain's Pitot tube. No other explanation adequately accounted for the specific pattern of false readings. The final report attributed the accident to pilot error, the crew's failure to recognize and respond correctly to the stall, but identified the blocked Pitot tube as the initiating cause, and identified multiple systemic factors that had made the outcome more likely: the maintenance ambiguities, the absence of training for this specific failure mode, the design of the 757's warning systems, and the autopilot's default configuration. Part 5. The system that failed. In the aftermath of any aviation accident, investigators are required to answer not just the question of what happened, but the question of why the system. The entire web of rules, training programs, aircraft design standards, maintenance procedures, and human decision-making failed to prevent it. Following the accident, Boeing redesigned elements of the 757's warning architecture. The ability to silence certain caution alerts without silencing others was added. The autopilot's default data source was modified to allow crews to easily designate which Pitot system the automation should reference. And the instrument comparison warning, now standard on modern commercial aircraft, was added to alert crews when the captain's and first officer's instruments were providing significantly different readings. These changes seem obvious in retrospect. In aviation, the changes that seem most obvious in retrospect are almost always the ones that required an accident to identify. Part 6. The Mirror in the Caribbean. If the story of Birgenair 301 had ended with the FAA directives and the Boeing modifications, it would be a clean story. An accident identified a problem. The problem was fixed. The system improved. This is how aviation is supposed to work. But 8 months after Birgenair 301, another Boeing 757 fell into the sea. On October 2, 1996, Airworthiness Flight 603 departed Lima, Peru on a night flight to Santiago, Chile. Shortly after takeoff, the crew discovered that their airspeed indicators, altimeters, and vertical speed indicators were all providing unreliable data. Unlike the Birgenair crew, the Airworthiness pilots quickly identified that their instruments were compromised. But unlike the Birgenair scenario, the situation they faced was even more severe. Maintenance crews had inadvertently left masking tape over the aircraft's static ports, which, unlike the Pitot tubes, affected not just the airspeed indicator, but virtually every pressure-based instrument in the cockpit. Aeroperu 603 flew for over an hour in total instrument chaos, in the dark, over the ocean, before striking the water. All 70 people aboard were killed. 2 Boeing 757s. 2 Pitot static system failures. 2 nights. 8 months apart. The proximity in time was not coincidence. It was evidence. Both accidents pointed to the same systemic failure. The aviation industry had not adequately addressed the vulnerability of Pitot static systems to physical contamination, whether from wasps, ice, or maintenance tape. And then, 13 years later, on June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447 departed Rio de Janeiro and climbed into the night sky over the South Atlantic. At cruise altitude, passing through a zone of convective weather, the aircraft's pitot tubes were blocked by ice crystals. For approximately 1 minute, the autopilot disconnected and the crew lost reliable airspeed data. 228 people died. But the family resemblance is undeniable. 3 accidents, 3 Pitot static system failures, 3 crews overwhelmed by the collision between what their instruments told them and what their training had prepared them for. The through line from Puerto Plata in 1996 to the South Atlantic in 2009 is direct and visible. Aviation learns from its accidents, but it does not always learn everything they have to teach on the first attempt. Part 7. Why this matters. Captain Ahmet Erdem made errors. He chose not to abort the takeoff when his airspeed indicator was malfunctioning. He drew the wrong conclusion when the 2 airspeed indicators disagreed. He failed to follow the cross-check procedure that might have identified the blocked pitot tube. He reduced thrust when he should have added it. These errors are real. They contributed directly to the deaths of 189 people. But to understand Birgenair 301 only as a story of pilot error is to miss almost everything important that it has to teach. Erdem had 24,750 hours of experience. He was not careless, not incompetent, not impaired. He was a man who had spent his entire professional life building the mental models and reflexes that aviation training told him he needed, and then encountered a situation that his training had not equipped him to handle. The scenario that confronted him, 1 blocked pitot tube generating simultaneous overspeed and stall warnings at night over the ocean 5 minutes after takeoff, was not in his training syllabus. It was not in anyone's training syllabus. The question that the blameless approach to accident investigation asks is not who made mistakes. It asks, why did the system create conditions in which those mistakes were likely? And when you ask that question about Birgenair 301, the answers cascade. Why were the pitot tube covers not in place? Because the maintenance manual was ambiguous about requirements. Why was the autopilot taking its data from the blocked pitot tube? Because that was the default configuration, and the crew had not reconfigured it. Why did the crew not recognize the blocked pitot tube scenario? Because they had not been trained for it. Why had they not been trained for it? Because the training system had not identified it as a plausible scenario. Why had the training system not identified it as a plausible scenario? Because no one had yet died from it in a way that forced the question. And at the end of this chain of whys, you arrive at the characteristic structure of almost every aviation accident. Not a single catastrophic failure, but a series of individually survivable decisions and design choices that, in combination and sequence, created a path to disaster. The mud dauber did not kill 189 people. A system did. In the aviation safety literature, the concept of latent conditions, failures or vulnerabilities that exist within a system long before they cause an accident, is central to understanding how disasters occur. The Swiss cheese model, developed by psychologist James Reason, describes how accidents happen when latent holes in multiple layers of safety align to allow a hazard to pass through all of them simultaneously. The latent conditions in Birgenair 301 were the ambiguous maintenance documentation about Pitot tube covers, the absence of training for simultaneous overspeed and stick shaker scenarios, the autopilot's default configuration linking it to a single Pitot tube, and the warning system architecture that could generate mutually contradictory simultaneous alerts. Each of these conditions had existed for years before February 6, 1996. Each of them had, presumably, been present on previous flights without causing an accident, because the specific combination of circumstances, a 25-day dormancy, a tropical airport with wasps, a night departure, the exact sequence of crew decisions, had not previously aligned. In the language of system safety, these were invisible wasps. Dangers present in the system that no one could see until they stung. Here is the thing about aviation safety that the history of Birgenair 301 ultimately demonstrates. It works. Not perfectly, not immediately, not without cost. But over the long arc of the industry's history, the willingness to investigate accidents rigorously, to ask the blameless question, to fix not just the obvious proximate causes, but the systemic latent conditions. This has produced a safety record that is, by any historical measure, extraordinary. The FAA's post-Birgenair 301 directive, mandating simulator training for blocked Pitot tube scenarios, has, in the years since 1996, put thousands of 757 and 767 crews through exactly the scenario that overwhelmed Erdem and his colleagues. Some of those crews have encountered blocked Pitot tubes in real operations and have recognized the failure mode in time to respond correctly. The number of lives saved by this training is impossible to calculate, but it is not zero. Boeing's modifications to the 757's warning architecture, the instrument comparison alert, the ability to silence specific caution warnings, have been incorporated into subsequent aircraft designs and have become part of the standard toolkit that modern pilots rely on when faced with sensor failures. And the lessons of Birgenair 301 are embedded in the training syllabuses of virtually every major airline in the world. The scenario that killed 189 people in 1996 is, today, a known scenario. Pilots know it. They practice it. They know what the simultaneous overspeed horn and stick shaker means in the specific context of a blocked Pitot tube. They know the cross-check procedure. They know not to trust a single instrument in isolation. This is how aviation progresses, not by preventing all accidents, that is impossible, but by extracting every possible lesson from the accidents that do occur and building those lessons into the system so that the same failure mode never, or almost never, claims another aircraft. The mud dauber built its nest in the dark, but the industry eventually turned on the lights. Epilogue. The passengers aboard Birgenair Flight 301 were, for the most part, ordinary people doing an ordinary thing. They had spent 2 weeks in the Caribbean sun. They were going home. They had tans and souvenirs and memories of beach bars and turquoise water. Many of them were probably asleep when the stick shaker began to vibrate the aircraft, or staring at the darkness through the windows, not knowing that anything was wrong until the final, catastrophic seconds. They included 167 German nationals, factory workers, teachers, pensioners, families with young children returning from winter holidays, 9 Polish nationals, including 2 members of the Polish parliament who had been on a diplomatic visit to the Caribbean, 13 crew members, Turkish and Dominican, who had chosen aviation as their profession. None of them knew, as they boarded at Puerto Plata, that a wasp had been living in the captain's Pitot tube. None of them knew that the 25 days their aircraft had been sitting on the tarmac had created a vulnerability in the one sensor system that the entire flight depended upon. None of them knew that the training their captain had received, for all its depth and rigor, had a gap in exactly the scenario that was about to unfold. They knew none of this because aviation works very hard to ensure that passengers never need to know these things, and most of the time it succeeds. On February 6, 1996, in the dark over the Caribbean, it did not succeed. But because of what happened on that night, because of the investigation, the findings, the mandates, the training changes, the design modifications, the system that failed Birgenair 301 became, over time, a system that is better prepared to protect the passengers who board the next 757, and the one after that, and the thousands of aircraft like it that depart airports around the world every hour of every day. That is not consolation enough for 189 deaths. Nothing could be. But it is the promise that aviation makes, that every life lost in the pursuit of flight will make the sky a little safer for everyone who follows. Birgenair 301, February 6, 1996. All 189 souls aboard. We remember them.